travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast 4th season. My loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. This is an amazing episode because Mark Russell returns to the mothership to discuss X Factor from Marvel Comics. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Russell. Thank you for coming to Traversing Stars Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
It's always good to have you back, returning champion. It's a pleasure to read X Factor, which you're now the writer of. How difficult is it to write within the larger continuity of the X franchise?
It's a lot of fun just because there are so many great mutants. It's like one of it's an embarrassment of riches. You have so much to choose from and such a rich history. Though you do have to be careful because there's already, so much continuity and so much that has gone before. You want to do justice to it without giving people what they've had 100 times already. So it's a big responsibility, but it's been a lot of fun.
So when you're thinking about writing for X Factor, are you thinking about in terms of expanding the continuity, or do you want to make sure it's written for people who maybe are not steeped in the continuity?
For me, always the latter. I always want to write assuming that this is somebody's first comic book or that they're not steeped, that they're not like just trying to backfill their Talmudic knowledge of the X-Men, but they actually just want a story that they hired me to actually tell an X-Men story the way I would tell it through in my voice. And that's kind of always been my guiding star is like I just want to tell a good story that if you've never read another X-Men comic, if you've never read another Mark Russell comic, you're gonna maybe, hopefully, enjoy this one.
So, and obviously, we came out of Krakoa, not that long ago. You're also writing as part of this huge group of other related comic books like X-Men. There's I don't know how many different X titles are for X-Men. There's like Exceptional X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, Regular X-Men. I think there's a couple of others. Um, how tied to those books is X Factor? Is there a plan that eventually they're all going to reach the same point?
There are a couple crossover events. I mean, for the most part, I'm writing my own story, not really in conjunction with those other comics, but in the same universe. But there are some points at which the stories cross over. Specifically, issue 7, which comes out next month, takes place in this with the sort of the Doom World announcement, which I'm sure you've heard about. So it will cross over with the other sort of Doom World stories, and then issue 8, immediately following, we do a crossover with the Manhunt story. So yeah, we are intersecting. We're going through two busy intersections in a row, but it was fun for me, one because I don't write a lot of crossovers, and two because I get to work with so many great creators who I've admired and who do their own thing, and try to make my work sound like it belongs. That I'm make it. It's like playing in a band versus playing a solo guitar on a at a folk club, which I'm usually playing in the folk club. But it was nice to be part of a band for a couple of issues, and yeah, it's been fun, but I also wanted to even the crossovers to work as their own individual issues. So it's somebody who hasn't read the rest of the crossover event, if they just read mine, they'll still sort of get what's going on.
Now, the other writers of the X books, I believe there's Eve Ewing, Jen McKay, Jeffrey Thorne. Um, obviously, there's you. Are you guys all in communication with each other? And when you're plotting, is there ever concern that what you're doing is something too close to what someone else is doing? How much communication is there among the team?
Well, there's a lot of communication. It's all kind of the traffic cop is obviously Tom Brevoort. He's sort of directing everybody, so we all had to submit outlines ahead of time, and he was sort of the one in charge of making sure that we're not like crossing over. We're not telling identical stories and stuff, which luckily doesn't seem to be that we are. And what I think is even more sort of fascinating about this sort of run of the X-Men universe is that tonally a lot of the series are very different, which I find really refreshing. Like it's like if you go into an ice cream parlor, so you go into Baskin Robbins, you're not going to want to find 31 flavors of chocolate. You want 31 completely different flavors. That's the way I think it should work, especially when you're doing these expansive universes. So I don't know if maybe I'm the Spumoni or the bubblegum ice cream or whatever and it might not be the flavor that everyone's looking for when everyone goes into the X-Men ice cream parlor, but you got to have different flavors in order for it to really function as an ice cream parlor. So that's, I think, one of the things that Tom and the team has really done well, sort of curated the ice cream parlor. So there are a lot of different flavors going on at the same time.
Now, X Factor is one of those. If you look at the echelon of X-Men titles, the top, very very top, you have X-Men, Uncanny X-Men. X Factor is like right there as well because X Factor's had such a long history going back into the '90s, where you had the original X-Men characters coming back into their own series. Then you had, which the series lasted a while. You had at some point you had the Sabretooth, part of the X Factor group. I mean, X Factor's had a long, rich history. When you think about what makes an X Factor book, what are you thinking about?
I think X Factor is good when it's a story about a team, individuals on a team, by which I mean they're there for a common purpose, but the purpose is not necessarily their own. They're there for their own personal reasons, but they're supposed to like sort of come together despite their differences and somehow serve a common purpose. And that purpose might not always be what they want. And so to me, that's the heart of X Factor. To me, it's the heart of living in a civilization. The fact that we're all living together and working towards a common purpose that we may not necessarily agree on, or that that common purpose might be to our detriment, might not be in our best interest, but we've sort of signed on to work together as this team.
And this, obviously with X had also a history of connecting to a government. I kind of feel like X Factor, especially even your series as well, it's very allegorical based on the idea of a tyrannical government, as we see about how they're trying to treat with the Mutant Surveillance Act and the direction they're going in. It feels very timely in what's going on in American history right this second. Um, so can you kind of dive into how it is how you are working that larger symbolic allegory with X Factor?
Yeah, it's sort of about misplaced loyalty, or about like trying to give the institutions of the country you live in the benefit of the doubt, even though they don't care about you, and about how we give our loyalties really easily to flags and to symbols that cannot and do not care about us back. And that's kind of the real tragedy of living in a country, is that you are putting your life on the line for people or for an idea that sometimes doesn't care whether you live or die.
Hmm. And I think one interesting word that shows up a lot in issue 6, which is very interesting, is the word traitor. It shows up in many different ways, describing many different types of people. Um, when you're thinking about the X Factor and the members, where does their allegiance lie? And where should it lie? Does it lie with um, the government that they're fighting for, or is it the other mutants that they're also kind of fighting for? And the mutants and the government are not it's not serving the same master that in that way. You either because the government, as you're showing it, is not support of the mutants that are in the country right now.
Well, I think that they discover pretty quickly that the government doesn't really have their best interests at heart, and that the mutants also are kind of like a problematic thing to serve mutants in general, because the mutants don't all agree. And there are mutants who are willing to betray them. And so I think what they discover over the course of the series is that their loyalty really should be to the other mutants and human beings who are in their immediate vicinity, the people that they come into contact, the people what they rely upon day in and day out for survival. That's where their loyalty should lie, not with these ideas, not with these superstructures that are would kill them or leave them for dead as easily as save them.
Like the part I'm thinking of is was it worse to be a traitor to? Is it worse to be a traitor to your country, to your people, or to yourself?
To your
Uh,
conscience, I think. I think being a traitor to your conscience is the worst thing. Not necessarily to yourself, because you might have your interests might not be your desires might not be good. But if your conscience is telling you what's right and what you should be doing, and you're turning it off to serve a higher power, then pretty much any atrocity or crime was within your power. You are have turned off the part of you that tells you when you're when what you're doing is wrong, and that's when we become sociopath.
is the one's conscious always correct?
No, it's not. But I think it's what tells us maybe when our brain isn't working right, or it's what tells us the direction to go and to find what's correct. Uh, Whereas if you turn that off, there's just no compass other than what you're being told to do or your own self interest. your own monetary or physical self-interest, neither of which are very good moral guides, neither one of which are something that will benefit the survival of the people you care about.
How are the members of X Factor all facing that question differently? Because obviously there's also a question of self-preservation, but there's also, like, say, the larger question of what your conscience is telling you to do. And once again,
Yeah.
what do
Well,
you?
it's very, sticky, and they come up with different answers because the incentives are all upon the incentives are all lined up in serving X Factor and shutting up and doing what X Factor tells you. But they can see with their own eyes that this is getting other mutants killed, or that this is going to get them killed at some point. And so, at what point can you take the money? At what point are you getting enough money to shut up? And I think that's what a question a lot of them have to ask is like, how much is enough to like shut up about what you're seeing and what you're doing? And at what point, do you need to ignore those incentives and turn your back on what you're being told and paid to do in order to be a good person,
And I
in order
think,
to be with
I,
yourself?
yeah, I think what's interesting. There's a great line, and a sequence in issue 6 as well, with the General Mills. She states, this is a little bit paraphrase, but she states basically, the value of X Factor is that they're expendable. One, is she saying the quiet part out loud and then say that should she not have voiced that part of her bigger plan for them?
It is sort of the quiet part out loud, but also I think that it's a moment where she is just telling them the truth because she wants them to understand that 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 she doesn't have to listen to their complaints. That yeah, they might be right and that they're all going to get killed, but that's not why they're not there to survive. They're there to serve X Factor, and they've already kind of made the deal with the devil, so now they have to pay the bill.
Will she come to regret saying that quiet part out loud or the truthful part out loud? And
Yeah, and I think this is why Havok holds on to his faith in X Factor so long, because he does believe there's a higher purpose. He does believe that X Factor, for all its problems, and the United States government, for all its problems, is still better than the alternatives. That if he doesn't serve them, if he doesn't help them, then someone even worse is going to take control of the planet, or recruit mutants that even cares even less about mutants. And so he feels like this is like a deal with the devil he has to make. But I think he comes to realize that the at the bottom, at the end of the day, when you make a deal with the devil, you should expect the devil not to uphold their terms of the contract.
and the two that she specifically says this to is Pyro and Havok. Um, is is this new information for them when she says that, or do they already kind of know? Yeah, this is what being X Factor is with in these terms. They don't care about us, and we're doing this anyway.
Yeah, I think she's just confirming their suspicions, and that's the point they're trying to make to her. And her point is kind of like, well, so what? Yeah, it's a job. It's like you don't go to a job to be fostered. You don't go to a job to have to be taken care of. You go to the job to get money in exchange for putting your life on the line.
And I think one interesting thing about issue 6 is that Havok is really the conscious of issue 6. Like, we're kind of experiencing what it is to be on X Factor, what it is to be a mutant on some level as well within the government through experience of Havok. So when you're thinking about which characters to kind of tell the story through, which ones whose eyes are best, this whole world is best viewed through, why are you choosing Havok?
Well, I wanted Havok both because he's like someone who's done X Factor before. He's a big name. He's a character that a lot of people already have a lot of emotional and cultural equity, and so people will identify with him. But also because he was recently dead. So I thought this would be a great sort of story about a guy who's recently come back to life. He has a second chance, and what is he going to do? What does he choose to do with that second chance? And because he really is thinking about philosophically, like what should I be doing now that I'm alive again? What is the best thing for? How can I serve the people I love the best now that I'm alive again? And it's a great sort of immediate philosophical perspective that being recently dead gives them.
I think one thing interesting about Havok is that Havok spent much of his character, the character's existence, under the shadow of Cyclops, being a Summer's brother. Do you view that as something that still lingers over him, or do you view him as someone who has now completely, as an individual, grown beyond that?
I think it hovers over him. I think that everything he's chosen before, and this is kind of what a lot of what his arc is about being haunted by the ghosts of his past. That being one of them, his relationship with Scott, and about sort of dealing with them one way or another as the series goes on. And spoiler alert, there will be he will have a meeting with Scott at some point in the series.
And so when you're thinking, I mean, once again, we're out of Krakoa, which has been like the large storyline for the X-Men for, I can't remember how long it lasts, but it was a pretty lengthy last. It was at least 3, 4, was it, did it hit 5 years? Can't quite recall. But it was around for a very long time, and it basically did absorb all the X-Men titles at once. When you're thinking about X Factor, and the characters are thinking about X Factor and their situation, do they view Krakoa as something that can never go become again? Like, is that something that is now a dream that's permanently over, or is that something that's still in their minds, in the right situation, can be reignited?
Well, I think what causes so much diversity in the opinions of the mutants in my series and X Factor is the fact that Krakoa just imploded. So everyone has different opinions about that. There are people like Polaris who still hold Krakoa up as this great ideal and this dream that isn't dead, and about the people who sort of like gave their lives for Krakoa are heroes who should be we should follow their example. And there's other people who are like, well, no, it's every mutant for themselves now. Krakoa is dead, and the best we can do is just sort of carve out our own niche in the human world, and hopefully, if possible, get revenge on it. Control the human world if we can. And then there's other people who are like, well, Krakoa is dead, but the other human nations are here, so the best thing to do is just to sort of integrate into the human nations. That's sort of where Havok and the people who join X Factor kind of are. It's like, well, I've got to work for a living somewhere, and X Factor is as good a place as any.
Hmm. When you're thinking about Krakoa as being this Eden, was it though? Is that rose-colored glasses? Is it just because it was better than what they've known before for the most part? Or is it one of those things where denial is a wonderful thing, especially if that's what you wanted to have happen? It's easy to deny the reality of what that was.
Well, I think the thing about Krakoa and the reason why it exists as this dream, as this sort of beacon in the minds of mutants, is that it didn't last very long in terms of the overall scale of human history. So it could still be sort of fantasized about. It could still be romanticized in a way like if it had lasted, for 50 years or whatever, it might have become like the Soviet Union or something. It might have been this totalitarian, nightmare state. But the fact that it died so young, people could still imbue it with their own dreams of what might have been.
I think that there's a character that you mentioned also in issue 6. I'm probably gonna say the name wrong. If I do, please correct me. Jovius? Am I saying it correctly?
Yeah, Jovius.
Okay, Jovius. The character seemed to represent the idea of what we, as you said, what you would romantically believe something could be versus the reality of the thing.
Yeah, he
Um,
gives a face to that sort of romantic belief in Krakoa, where it's like this is what it means to be a good mutant, to be willing to sacrifice yourself for your fellow mutants and for the dream that was Krakoa.
does he exist though as a example of the delusion?
I think so in the end. I don't want to give too many spoilers out, but yeah, I think it's sort of again this idea of he's sort of like their Che Guevara, and it's like yeah, he's romanticized and he looks great on a T-shirt, but even that is sort of that dream is sort of problematic.
Um, if this is a spoiler, I can always edit it out. So please, I mean, because it is kind of a spoiler, but if you want to cut, please let me know and I'll cut it.
That's okay.
Um,
I think we skirted around it good enough. I don't think it's going to spoil anything.
how important is that character though going forward?
Well, he's sort of the face of the Mutant Underground, which is the group that Bruin and Polaris belong to. So he's very important as a figurehead, and he does come into play later in the series. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, now that you mentioned the Music Underground, as presented in issue 6, they're not very competent, are they?
No, and this is part of the problem when you have like a splinter state, like when Krakoa that gave mutants sort of leadership and direction. When it implodes and everyone's trying to recreate that on their own, the sad thing is they're not all going to be really qualified for that. They're not all good at that. They're just kind of going like Polaris says. It's like they're just sort of copying things they saw on TV. about the way they think a government should run, not necessarily anything that makes sense for where they are, and which is kind of tragic. They're trying to dress for the job they want, not the job they have, but they end up looking kind of ridiculous as a result.
And it was kind of unfortunate because when you think about X Factor and the mutants in X Factor and where they could go as their alternative, which the logical alternative as presented so far is Mutant Underground, is that really the group you want to like put your lot with?
I think they would probably you'd probably your likelihood to survive is probably longer in the mutant underground than is an X Factor. And I do think that it's sort of like X Factor is where the realists go, and mutant underground is where the idealists go. And then there's just the sociopaths who end up in like X term, which is like this mutant mercenary group that just hires itself out to the highest bidder, and tries to like carve a place for mutants in like the sort of the mercenary economy of the world.
It's kind of funny. Like, if Mutant Underground represents the idealist, it does not speak very highly of idealists. Because obviously, like I said, those the leader group, like you said, do not seem to know what they're doing. I mean, the
They're
ideas are
trying to make it up as they go along because, but I mean, I think this is what every sort of resistance organization goes through. So they're not. The whole point is they're formed in resistance to a power, into a to an organized state or institution that's been around probably for hundreds of years, knows what it's doing, if only by trial and error and tradition. You don't have that when you're forming a resistance group, so you're at a big disadvantage. What you do have, what your advantage is that people really believe in your cause. They are not just punching the clock and doing a job. And so you get this energy, you get this sort of imagination and creativity that you wouldn't have if they were working for X Factor. But yeah, in terms of like knowing how to run an organization, not as much.
um interestingly enough, as we're talking about mostly being an idealist, being someone, can you be an idealist and have a country or government? Because you got to do some dirty things. It seems like, especially like putting on people on trial, things of that nature. You do have to get dirty to do it. It seems like, especially the X Factor seem to be proof of that. Can the Mutant Underground exist the way they are if they want to be serious, and seriously function long term?
Well, this is kind of the question that both members of the Mutant Underground and members of X Factor both have to answer. And so, what the members of the Mutant Underground have to ask: to what extent are they willing to sacrifice their ideals to exist in this world? And the people in X Factor have to ask the same question from the other direction: at what point do you sacrifice the people around you in this world to serve this sort of higher mission of X Factor?
Now, if I understand what was said before, said in the issue, it sounds like the Mutant Underground did give power to Bruin and Polaris. Is that correct? They are now the
Yeah,
leaders of the Mutant Underground.
that's correct.
How suited are they to? I mean, if the Mutant Underground leaders who they had were not well suited, how well suited then is Bruin and Polaris?
I think they're much better than the previous leadership. Bruin is sort of like the statesman. He's is great at sort of enunciating, sort of idealizing, putting the ideals of the mutant underground into words and giving them focus. And Polaris is like a great sort of tactician. She is really great at putting things into motion and knowing what to do. So I think together as a team, they're really good. And I think that every sort of successful startup, revolution, beginner nation has had that sort of team where you have the visionary and then you have the executive. And I think they formed that really well. They're much better than what came before in Mutant Underground.
Now, you feel free to dance around this, but I feel like the direction for that Havok is going is that he is heading towards Mutant Underground. Is that the direction he's going in, or is that just me reading into it?
I think he is. I wouldn't say he's heading towards Mutant Underground in terms of him joining it. I think he's seeing their point now. I think whereas he started in complete opposition to them, thinking they were crazy cakes and idealists, now he's sort of beginning to see why they were so against anyone serving an X Factor. That everything that kind of warned him about X Factor was true. That doesn't mean they're right. It just about Mutant Underground, but they were certainly correct about X Factor.
Um, Given what happens in issue 6, at the current moment, where is X Factor? As far as are they still a team, or are they now in their own directions? Are they still, are they still viably a team that exists as one right now?
Yeah, they're still viably a team, and I think largely because Angel has come back as the leader, and he's sort of the focal point. He's sort of the one who's been on it before and knows, and he can sort of like lead them. Havok and Frenzy are off the team. They both decided they couldn't serve at the expense of the members anymore. They couldn't just watch these people in their care get killed for no good reason, so they're off the team. But Angel's back, and so the team still exists with under his leadership.
Since Havok and Frenzy are off the team, are they off the book?
No, there's still characters in the series. They're still big characters in the series. They're just not in X Factor at this moment.
How fluid now is the makeup of the team gonna look now going forward?
There's a couple of replacements because now that they're off the team, they bring in obviously Angel comes back, so he's replacing Havok as team leader, and Forget Me Not comes in basically as Frenzy's replacement. So there's still, I guess Forget Me Not is the big sort of new member.
So when we're thinking about in terms of X Factor, who is the main antagonist then? Is it the government for in terms of Havok? Is Havok now the villain in terms from point of view of X Factor? Who's the major antagonist going forward?
I think it's everyone who's trying to control the world. So I think that the X Factor is certainly an antagonist, but so is X Term, and so is Doom.
Oh, because he's going to be so the next issue because it's part of the crossover. Because the thing with crossovers is that quite often crossovers are kind of like that insert issue that kind of just something happens and then they kind of move on to the next storyline because it's kind of like an interruption. Is this crossover going to be have a major impact then on X Factor going forward, or is it more like an
Yes.
insert?
No, it has a major impact. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because in issue 7, there's a quantum computer. There's a powerful quantum computer that's owned by Ethan Farthing, the billionaire who runs the Paperclip AI, which powers, all of his like inventions. And they're afraid of what will happen if when Doom takes over the planet he gets his hands on this quantum computer. So it would basically allow him to turn every person on the planet into a biological version of a Doom bot. So they think we've got to, if nothing else, destroy this quantum computer so that Doom doesn't get his hands on it. And this sort of becomes the center point of the conflict for the second arc, the
So,
last five, the next 5 issues.
so the Doom issue does continue. So basically, the next four, even after the Doom crossover, is still within the that storyline.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that storyline, but it certainly has echoes. It runs throughout the next 5 issues.
So, and also, I don't want to forget the artist in the book, which is Bob Quinn. So, can you tell me a little bit about what is that partnership is like, and what does he bring to the table?
Well, I've worked with Bob on a lot of different titles. I've worked with him probably on more individual issues than I've worked with any other artist. So I know what I'm getting with them, and that sounds like I'm like I'm disappointed, but I'm not because Bob is amazing. He's like a great artist, and he's great at nailing sort of this sad comedy, the sort of both like these funny moments, but also the resonance of like these sort of personal tragedies. And he is also an underrated virtue in comic art. He's really quick. He's the only artist I've ever been afraid of catching up to me in the writing because he's just so fast and good. So yeah, working with Bob, you got to be on your toes writing wise. You got to stay one step ahead because he's right behind you.
Yeah, I
But
think
I love seeing his pages. His pages always crack me up, and they're wonderful.
yeah, I love the idea of especially with a great artist is that the great artists or actors as far as with their characters that they really do have to convey a whole lot of emotion, and not all artists put the same kind of effort I think into drawing emotion as other artists.
It's the number one thing I look for. I think it's more important to be able to draw like convincing and moving emotion on in characters and their faces and their body language than it is to draw great battle scenes. I would take the emotion art in a heartbeat over somebody who can draw like a 2-page spread with 100 characters all fighting.
Yeah. So along with obviously X Factor going forward, we discussed what we expect in the future. What's next for you?
In X Factor or beyond after X Factor? Beyond
Everything.
it. Oh well, now that you've opened the door, I want to talk about a couple books I've got coming out.
Okay.
The collected edition of Traveling to Mars, which I did through a Blaze, which I feel like is maybe the best thing I've ever written. That comes out at the end of January. So talk to your local comic shop, ask them to save you a copy of Traveling to Mars, the graphic novel, available both in hardback and in trade. And then there's also a prose book I've written, a non-comic called Grim and Grimmer, which is about the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. It's me retelling 13 classic Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and that comes out at the end of February. So you might want to ask about that one too.
Well, like I said, we're both of those titles. I would love to have an opportunity to talk to you about them when they come out, so I can read them. The Grim Fairy Tales one that sounds really interesting too. So when you say retelling, can you kind of go a little more into what that means as a retelling the Grim Fairy Tales?
Yeah, they're very dark and funny, which is just me sort of capturing what the way I felt when I read them. Because I'm retelling not the Disney version, but the original sort of German, Grimm brothers versions from like the 18th century. And there's some very, fascinatingly, sort of macabre things that happen in these fairy tales. And so I'm trying to recapture that as opposed to like doing the Disney version. And I think it automatically, the fact that I make them short and the fact that I try to stay true to like the original sort of macabre nature of these stories makes them instantly funnier and also much, much darker.
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize just how dark they are. And I remember when I was a kid, really, really young, my father would read us Grimm fairy tales. And I know he skipped some parts because we were like maybe like 5 or 6 years old that I guess we weren't supposed to know about when we were that age. But those are some really harsh stories. People don't think realize just how harsh they are.
Yeah, the people don't realize because I mean, obviously, their experience with these fairy tales is usually the Disney cartoons. But like at the end of Cinderella, the Cinderella's like bird friends like peck the eyes out of her two stepsisters, and that's how the story ends. Or the Wicked Witch in the Snow White story, she shows up at Snow White's wedding, and they put glowing red hot metal shoes on her, and they watch as she dances herself to death. They give her the first dance at the wedding, and it's basically her dancing around trying to get these glowing red hot metal shoes off her feet and dying doing it. So yeah, it's a little, it's a little, it, it's a little dark.
Well, like I said, I look forward to both of them. I'm traveling to Mars. I'm a big sci-fi nerd, so that sounds awesome. Mr. Russell, it's an absolute honor to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a fantastic night.
You too.